Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with perfect pork chops. That's right, the real name for this video is how to dry brine pork chops, but that name wasn't quite as catchy as perfect pork chops. And besides, they're pretty much the same thing, because by using this very simple technique, you can pretty much ensure perfect pork chops every time. And if you're wondering if there's some kind of catch, there really isn't. Although I guess you do have to figure out you want pork chops a day ahead of time. But other than that, an incredibly straightforward technique that only requires 3 ingredients. And no, water's not one of them. So into this ramekin, I'm going to add a couple spoons of kosher salt, as well as a spoon of freshly ground black pepper. And then last but not least, and I'm sure you did not see this coming, we'll finish off with some cayenne. And then we'll take our freakishly small wooden spoon, and as soon as that's mixed up, our dry brine is done. And if you're thinking to yourself, dry brine is a ridiculous name because there's no liquid in this. How can it be a brine? Well, you know what? You're absolutely right. But regardless, it really does actually brine the meat pretty much the same way. Hence the nonsensical and very oxymoronic name. So really what this is a dry rub, but what it does is dry brine. But anyway, we can discuss that on the blog post. For now, we're going to need some meat. And what I'm going to be using here are 2 beautiful center cut pork chops, which features this kind of T-shaped bone at the end. And one quick tip, because that bone is generally thicker than the meat itself, this cut is much better for grilling than it is for pan frying. And you'll see why later. But the point is, this is really going to work on any kind of pork chop. And all we're going to need to do here is take our dry rub, I meant dry brine, and generously apply it to both sides. And no, that's not too much. In fact, you could put a little more. Okay, we want to make sure both sides are covered. And by the way, a lot of people do like to include a little sugar in the brine mix, but I usually don't. I've tried it, and it doesn't really cause any problems. But I don't find these come out any juicier whether you use it or not. Plus, I often serve my grilled pork with sort of a sweeter type sauce, so I don't necessarily need that meat to have another layer of sweetness. So I'm just going to go with salt, pepper, cayenne. But regardless of what you're actually using in your dry brine, we do want to make sure those pork chops are coated generously. And once we are confident that's happened, what we'll do is transfer these onto a rack, because these are going to spend 1 day uncovered brining, quote unquote, in the fridge. And by the way, if you don't have a rack, you could just crinkle up some foil. That would work okay. Or even better, go buy a rack. You need one of those in the kitchen. But anyway, once that's set, we'll go ahead and pop that in the fridge for between 18 and 24 hours, which is my official recommendation. Some people think you could do this in less time, like in a matter of hours. So that's up to you. If you want to try it with a little less time, go ahead. When it comes to osmosis, you are the hostess. But I did let mine go for 24 hours, after which it looked like this. And as you may have gathered from those marks on the surface, I did give these a flip about halfway through, which I'm pretty sure is totally unnecessary. But hey, I've never let that stop me before. And what I find so interesting here is this looks and feels exactly like something that was brined and then dried off. So that's why I really do love this technique so much. We basically get all the benefits of brining without any of the associated wetness. And that, believe it or not, is pretty much it for our dry brining demo. Because now you're free to go ahead and cook that pork chop any way you want, which for me this time is going to be on a charcoal grill. And to prep these for that, I'm going to go ahead and brush them with a few drops of vegetable oil on both sides before heading outside to the grill. And no, not the usual grill. That one broke. But as some of you may know, I do have an old pile of bricks in the backyard. And sometimes we'll arrange those into a makeshift grill, which really does work beautifully. In fact, I might not even buy another grill. So we'll go ahead and grill these chops to perfection, which for me is an internal temp of about 135. And by the way, I didn't film it this time because we've done it in old steak and chop videos. But if you make 1 or 2 shallow slices through that fat just to the meat around that edge, you won't have to worry about it curling up as it cooks, and it will lay a little flatter. But anyway, just in case you were wondering what those cuts were, and as I mentioned earlier, because of their bone structure, I find these center cut varieties much better for the grill than pan frying. Because that bone is thicker than the meat, it's almost impossible for the meat near the bone to come in contact with your pan. Okay, you see those light parts? So when we're grilling, that's not that big of a deal. But in a pan, that bone prevents the chop from laying flat, and you really don't get that great of a sear. And speaking of bones, because that end is a little thicker and denser, it's not a bad idea to flip them up this way and let them cook like that for a little while. That spot's always going to cook a little slower, so I do like to give that bone a little direct heat as shown. But anyway, I went ahead and finished grilling those off to an internal temp of about 135. In fact, if you have one of those old cookbooks that tells you to cook it to 180, you could just go ahead and throw that away. And one of mine was a little thicker than the other, so I needed to give it a couple more minutes. And then once both my chops were done to my liking, I headed inside to let them rest for 5 minutes. I know you want to eat now, so do I. But they're going to be so much better 5 or 6 minutes from now. And I mentioned I shoot for an internal temp of 135, but if you don't have a thermometer, you can basically use the same test we use for a chicken breast. Or if it's semi-firm and springs back like this, it's probably pretty close. Okay, if it feels mushy, it's undercooked, and if it feels hard, it's overcooked. But anyway, I let mine rest for about 5 minutes before plating up next to some proper arugula, and I finish this up with a spoon of spicy kumquat chutney. And if you're thinking spicy kumquat chutney, that looks like your kumquat marmalade that you just stirred some rice vinegar and hot sauce into. Possibly. But anyway, forget about that beautiful sauce. What I really want you to focus on is the effect that dry brining has on this meat. And for once, I actually shot at a good angle where you can see this. Look at that amazing, glistening, juicy meat. And as I prove in almost every video, I don't know any food styling and don't do any of those tricks. So that is 100% natural. Just so juicy, so tender. And above and beyond all that locked-in moisture and fantastic mouthfeel, the flavor is also amazing. Basically, this chop has been seasoned from the inside out, and it tastes like it. So let me go for another piece here, only this one I'm going to bedazzle with a jewel of that candy kumquat. Oh man, was that good. And I realize that some of you, especially the ones that like things to make sense, will have a problem using the term dry brine. That's okay. Nobody cares what you call this, as long as you do it on a regular basis. So I really do hope you give these perfect pork chops a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.